Today we're talking about historical revisionism of current French history and, of course, ancient French history. Welcome back to T-Rex Talk. This is Isaac Botkin talking to several people on the King's Hall podcast. Now, all of you have individual names. Actually, some of you, I believe, are part of other podcasts, but technically, we're not speaking to the other podcasts. We're speaking to the King's Hall podcast. I know your voices better than your faces. Could you introduce yourselves to the T-Rex audience, please?
Yeah, so we have Brian Sauvé.
Good to be here.
French. You know, it's a knock against him, but we'll allow
like Charlemagne, Clovis the First. A lot of the greatest men ever to live in the West. I mean,
the Olympics,
similarly.
Olympics.
The ancient, like the earlier ones, before all the gay stuff today.
All this stuff today. And Dan Burkholder.
I'm here. Yep. Thanks for having me.
Dan Burkholder. And then I am Eric Kahn. So.
Very good. Yeah. Now, you guys have multiple things that you do on the internet, but collectively, you are the King's Hall podcast. And you've been doing some fascinating historical conversations about a number of things. Histories that we may be less familiar with. And one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about specifically is historical revisionism. We've been talking about historical revisionism in some T-Rex content for a while. And you guys have been digging into the Crusades. If there's anything that history has decided, the modern textbooks make this very clear. Everyone agrees that the Crusades were bad. Everyone agrees that the Crusades were bad, and you guys have a slightly different take on that particular topic. But before we get there, it's kind of interesting how, in my opinion, historical revisionism used to be relegated to stuff that happened so long ago that we kind of forgotten. Because the Crusades, the First Crusade is, very, very, very long ago. We're talking about 1100s, 1200s, 1300s. That is long enough ago that we don't really remember it super clearly personally. But I'm seeing historical revisionism happen around stuff that happened last week. And if I were reading the news, I'd probably see historical revisionism happening about stuff that's happening this week. What are you guys noticing the same things?
Yeah, for sure. I think a big part of it too. You have, I think, what Orrin McIntyre is described as, because the media and everything, you get the information so fast, you can get it on X, but you have really the control of media plus the, what he'll call the total state, but really just this state regime apparatus that's controlling that narrative. And it's interesting now because there's the conflict between people with a lot of smartphones, say at the Trump assassination attempt. So you have all the people with the smartphones and nerds with, the ability to, dissect, sound engineer, cell phone data. So you've got all that. And then meanwhile, you're watching it with your own eyes. And you have people like, the director of the FBI who's saying things like, well, I'm not sure he was actually shot even. And so I think because of that, the revisionist history, you're able to see it. And it's causing you to say to yourself, wait. I think I just saw that. But now we have people who are denying reality in almost real time. So that's kind of an interesting feature.
I think it's important.
Well, you can't Google it anymore. So
yeah, they've
I don't know what you guys are even talking about.
Yeah, right. The Trump assassination. I put in assassination of, and it just Truman, someone, I don't know.
Abraham
Lincoln. I do think it's interesting.
Did you mean Ronald Reagan assassination attempt? Yeah.
I do think it's interesting to understand, though, on a meta level, that history isn't just comprised, at least the study of history by people, isn't just comprised by, some set of bare facts. Bare facts are almost impossible to achieve because most of history, most of the data of history is going to be some account or retelling of events from witnesses. And yeah, you can bring in you can bring in different data that is, more quote unquote objective, but it's one of these not whether but which things that people participate in. When we're telling history, we're telling a story, and we're always either telling that story in the service of truth or in the service of falsehood. So it's interesting to me to see the way that the obfuscation and historical revision around the Trump assassination is being done for the exact same motive that the historical revision surrounding the Crusades was happening and has been happening for some time, which is to prop up a worldview, to prop up an idea of the good and what we ought to be about as a people, who we are. All of these things come into play in both of these situations. And so for us, one of the things we try to do a lot in King's Hall is not just to give bare facts, but to tell the true story of history set in its didactic setting, which is to teach people how to live. Because history is supposed to teach us who we are, where we come from, where we're going, and how we ought to live we're a part of history in the story. So this isn't like a side issue here when we talk about historical revisionism. We have to recognize that we're in a war of stories, and it's important that we tell the true story, and we tell the true story well, so that that story can win, and we can know who we are, where we come from, where we're going.
Yeah. I think that is a vital observation, and it is frustrating to me. I found history extremely boring as a topic back when I was reading textbooks, because textbooks were facts, ostensibly facts, individual disconnected facts. The only thing holding them together was they were in a chapter that kind of covered a particular historical area or maybe a geographic area, but they were just disconnected facts. And the way that these facts connect, the way that they actually reveal the lives of human beings, the things they did, the effect that those actions had on other human beings, shaping the world that we live in. When I began to read historical biographies and histories written by people that had, they didn't have just a per word count pay from the Department of Education, for example, real stories emerged from the history. The stories of my ancestors and your ancestors emerged from just the disconnected, discombobulated facts. And that was when I started to care about history and be interested in history. And over time, I grew to love history. But I'm also being told that I'm on the wrong side of history. And I'm also being told that everybody gets their own history.
Yeah, it's a common theme. I mean, especially the Crusades is a good example of it. You have the left's telling of it. Of course, even Obama, Bill Clinton, they would say this is one of the greatest atrocities that was ever committed. And, we're like a lot of people. There were just certain issues where we started reading books. I think originally we read like God's Battalions, Rodney Stark. You get into Raymond Ibrahim with Defenders of the West. You start reading these books and you realize, wait a minute, these narratives that we were given in public school particularly are not true. And so you ask that pivotal question, right? You say to yourself, well, if they lied to me about that, what else was I lied to about? And then you can start piecing this together and reading other stuff. And then you realize there is maybe a whole different way, Dan, to look at like world history because of that.
Yeah, the textbook example that you gave is actually quite interesting, because I almost suspect that it's intentional that they would make history as boring as possible in a lot of ways, because we're studying our history, which is the history of the West, which is the history of Christianity. And so what better way to dissuade people from actually looking into things than to just give data points, dates, different locations. Hey, there was a battle at Yarmouk in the 7th century and some people died. And, it was just one of many clashes between Christians and Muslims, not realizing that the Battle of Yarmouk was an offensive attack from Muslims against Christians that predated the Crusades by, 400 years, and there's a whole story there. But by simply giving you, just boring data, why would you look into it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And some of that, I think it has I would say the feel, it has the veneer of an honest mistake. Like the people writing these books were themselves bored by some of this history, and that is why they didn't spend as much time on it. That's why they didn't delve deeply enough into it. But over time, it becomes much more overt, like an agenda is being pushed here. I remember when I was a kid, there was a kerfuffle. One of the school administrators up in Massachusetts said that Christopher Columbus's navigators were almost certainly Muslims.
Almost certainly not.
This is no. First of all, you have to remember this is a long time ago. This is back when Christopher Columbus was not cool, but he was still not a genocidal maniac. Like he was still a legit explorer, and his legit exploring was being done thanks to the help of Islam. And this is like, hang on a second. 1492 is actually not that long ago in the sweep of history. Like, we have his logs. We have his actual crew manifest. We have the actual name of his actual navigator. Like, we don't have to speculate, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. We know that the Reconquista just happened. We know that his expedition was financed because there weren't Muslims in Spain anymore. Like, there's a lot of stuff that we know for sure. Why would you say this in direct contradiction of all the facts, all the disconnected facts that you have already taught me?
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because you're talking about, all this stuff. Is it, coincidental, or is it part of a bigger, campaign? And I would say, yeah, it's a bigger campaign against the West. But it's interesting because in the last, 10 years, people have become more and more cognizant of the fact that, CRT and wokeness, they're trying to destroy progressive leftism. They're trying to destroy Western civilization. But especially if you go back to something like Pat Buchanan and the Death of the West, he was talking about the first thing that you do if you want to destroy the West is you have to destroy its monuments and its heroes. You have to destroy its history. And so this was one, again, where we said, wait a minute, if they're trying to destroy it, you watch the enemy and they're targeting this position in the battle line. And then we say, well, I think that that's a really important part in the battle line too. We're actually going to try and inspire people to defend what is Christian Western civilization. And I think a big part of that is you look at really what other people have called the suicide of the West. It's this self-hatred that we've been taught to hate ourselves because we're white, because we're Christians. And so really the failure is a failure of the will of the people of the West. And what we're trying to do is kind of rekindle that passion for people. When you read about Jan Sobieski and the charge of the Winged Hussars, there's this pivotal battle in Vienna that saved the West in that time period. And they were outnumbered, they were outgunned, all that stuff. When people hear those stories, the number one piece of feedback we get is, man, I want to be a Winged Hussar.
Yeah.
So do I.
And it's like a lot of this has to do with the post-war consensus mentality that we've been trained in post-World War II. Essentially, in the post-war consensus comes down to the idea that we need to be ruled by a globalist cabal of nations that come together to prevent Holocaust 2.0 from happening. And so to do that, we have to embrace globalism. We have to eradicate a lot of the particularity of the West and the Christian West in particular, because if Christians in the West identify self-consciously as we are Westerns, we're Anglo, we're European, we are Protestant, we're Christian, even we're Roman Catholic, and we are therefore not Hindu, we're therefore not Muslim, we're therefore not Buddhist. Well, if you're going to have people embrace this kumbaya, we're all one thing, nations should be permeable, borders should be permeable, all of our thoughts should be permeable, we need to embrace relativism religiously, you have to destroy this idea that Christians, if they read history unvarnished, would conclude things like Islam is the enemy of Christianity and it cannot peacefully coexist with it, historically speaking. It just can't. Those two ideas don't coexist. If Christians recognize that about themselves and say, Islam is actually an enemy and it will never settle for peaceful coexistence with Christianity. It's a religion of conquest, colonization, and imperialism. And history bears this out. Well, if you want people to embrace the post-war consensus of relativism and globalism, one of the first things that has to go is the self-conscious identity of Western and American Christians as we are a Protestant and Christian people. That's who we are. And so to do that, history becomes a vehicle of sabotage of people's self-understanding. I think that's really important to see, that this was deliberate. They're really trying to actually take that away from you so that you can be conquered.
I think it's important too to realize it's deliberate, but it's also being sped up in this moment. So we've seen whatever was happening up till 2020, right? Then it was like we turned on the nitrous oxide and we pushed the gas pedal to the floor from the leftist viewpoint. And so I think now, you get to the assassination attempt and all these things. I think that the deep state, the regime is desperate. And so you're going to see these things even more out in the front and center of the public square.
Yeah. And I see people arguing on kind of both sides of this, where this acceleration, some people are like, this is because they're confident that they've already won and there's no reason to go slow. And other people saying this is because they realize that they've crossed a Rubicon, a point of no return. And now it's like a desperate attempt, a Hail Mary pass to just floor it and see if history can be destroyed fast enough.
It kind of reminds me, honestly, of the tactical instincts of Stonewall Jackson early in the Civil War, when he said, if the South is to have any chance against this greater foe of the North, they're more industrially complex and capable, have more people, then the South basically has to wage a black flag war and go invade. They need to cross the border into the North, and they need to burn and destroy and wage total war everywhere they go and win quickly. I am more inclined towards that view of the left, that they realize that in terms of identity politics and all of they've built their whole case around the identity politics of the left, right? This, like, we are relativists, we're globalists, we're, all the woke that they've been doing. And the right recognizes that they've been invaded and that they're losing ground rapidly. And I think they realize they have to finish the conquest and totally declare victory, or there's going to be a huge, wave back.
Yeah, I think so. This is like when you're playing poker and you keep upping the ante, and you've gone in so much that you're like, well, I guess we're all in.
Yeah, sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
One of the things that the left has used, and you see this with the Crusades and with the Trump attempted Trump assassination and many other things, race issues, is the weaponization of guilt. And so you should feel shame for being the way you are. You're Protestant, you're white, you're male, whatever it is, you should feel guilt for that because you're an oppressor, whatever. And what I think what is happening, and what has accelerated this movement from the left, is it's not working. It's you have a counterculture that's rising in the dissident right and in the Christian right and Christian nationalism and other movements, both good and bad. Is that weaponization of guilt is no longer working because guys are saying, like, yeah, I'm white. I'm a white guy and I love being white.
You actually
and I
don't
love
even
my
feel
people.
bad about it.
Actually, now that you mention it, I kind of like that.
My people are actually great. I come from great men. I could be a great man.
Yeah.
We could be a great people. That is a tremendously and exceedingly dangerous thought from their perspective for us to believe.
That's why Eric's insults to Brian about being French never work. Because it's like,
work.
oh, you ever hear of the greatest king ever? Yeah, Charlemagne.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm from his stock. Yeah.
It's
right.
more like,
Direct.
He's Anglo-Saxon. Come on. I mean,
I'm a part of Anglo-Protestant culture, but via
right.
French immigration into the U.S. But
That's right.
Normans and so forth. Yeah. Well, let's get back to the Crusades, because that is something that I wasn't told overtly about, that I should feel guilty for the Crusades in the textbooks. But later I have been told that I personally should feel great guilt for the Crusades. But then as I read accounts of battles, I'm like, oh, you want me to attach my identity to the Crusades? Well, I am a winged hussar now. I'm like, fine, I'll double down on this.
Yeah,
when they came sweeping down,
working.
yeah, like you told me that I'm inextricably linked to these guys. I'm inextricably linked to Richard I, who was so valiant that even Saladin wrote that, man, I hope Richard ends up in control of the Holy Lands if I lose, because what a great leader he would be. Yeah, fine. I don't feel guilty about it, but I'll take that historical connection. So let's talk about the Crusade. Let's start at the beginning, because as listeners to the podcast probably know, there isn't a crusade. And the last crusade, it might have been the one with Indiana Jones, but there are lots and lots of individual crusades between the 1100s and obviously the last crusade with Sean Connery.
Yeah, that's right. So really, as I think these guys have pointed out, you start with Yarmouk, which is the 700s. Of course, Muhammad arrives on the scene. 500s takes him quite a while actually to convert anybody but his own family. But the minute they gain power, there's conflict with the Christians around them. This speeds up and grows. So I think, Rabin Ibrahim, who's a historian, has been really helpful here. A book like Sword and Scimitar really helpful in understanding that we hear this narrative that the Crusades just erupted because it was like a pre-colonial form of European domination of the world. And really, it was a response to aggression. By the time the Crusades in 1099 thereabouts, that time period, by the time the First Crusade starts, you've got hundreds of years of onslaught from the Muslim empires, to the point that I think you've lost almost like 70% of what was the total of Christendom at that point because of Northern Africa, the Middle Eastern area, what we would consider that today. All of that had been lost to Islam. And then Raymond Ibrahim is really good about pointing to some of really the subjugation that was going on, sex slavery for children. There's just so much rampant wickedness. Well, when you start to understand all this, you can understand why, the Christians eventually fought back. And that's how we get to the First Crusade with Pope Urban and saying we've got to do something about the rape and pillage of the Holy Land and understanding the significance back then, not to Zionism and Judaism, but to Christianity and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and those sorts of things. So you can begin to understand why there was a call to defend the Christian West.
Yeah, we even think of, when we say the West, and we think, well, we're a people who are descended from the West, and we're Westerners, and we're, Western history is Christian history. And that sort of narrative really exists because of the Muslim conquest of Christendom, which was by no means a mere Western phenomenon, but it was the Eastern and the Western Christendom all together that had been conquered, subjugated, enslaved. Christians lived in all of these lands under dhimmi status, which is a status of a conquered people who are, people of the book. They're supposed to have certain rights, but they're completely subjugated. And so Christians, after hundreds of years of this, were looking and hearing the cries of their brothers and sisters in these other lands whose children are being enslaved and raped by Muslim men, whose wives are being taken. To such an extent, the sex slavery trade was so rampant in Islamic and Muslim culture because it's not actually considered sinful in their culture at all to subjugate women in this way. Royal family lines and noble lines in Muslim families became majority white and majority like Western European, we would think, because they had taken so many white women from Christian lands and put them in the harems of Muslim royalty that their offspring became progressively, they were genetically very similar to the Christians. And that shows you how rampant this mistreatment was. And so Christians then looked back and they said, look, we have a duty. These are not Muslim lands. These are Christian lands. These were lands that for centuries were peacefully ruled by our Christian brothers and sisters. And now they're being violently abused and subjugated. So we have a duty, not out of mere superstition for a place, like we've got to go retake the Holy Land because that's where Jesus. There were elements of zeal stirred up by that as well. These were the lands that Christ walked. They ought to be held by Christians. But a majority of it really had to do with their love for their brothers and sisters and their tenderness to seeing their plight at the hands of a wicked and evil culture, a demonic culture that worshipped a false god and was shaped like that false god. And so it was not fundamentally about let's go get treasures and wealth and let's plunder these lands. And most of the men who undertook these crusades lost whole fortunes, mortgaged their entire estates, and lost everything up to and including their lives in order to try and rescue their brothers. They weren't going and plundering for the sake of their own material gain.
No, it was vastly depleting the resources of Europe, which is why eventually it would cease. But I also think part of it is the way that we view violence today. So, what'll happen with historians, again, I mentioned earlier that like Bill Clinton would speak about this, Obama would speak about this, and they'd say, look at the horrors at the end of the First Crusade, when you have the capture of Jerusalem. And I think what's often missed is that was a very bloody time period. It's a bit like reading the Old Testament in the Bible, and you're like, well, siege warfare was brutal. But again, when you start realizing that this is like pre-Geneva Convention, okay? So that didn't exist.
Sure, yeah.
And this is what war was like. If you went to siege a city and the other party said, we're going to fight to the death, we're not going to let you take it, it was understood on both sides that meant when you took the city, as they did Jerusalem, you were basically going to kill everybody. And you see this happening on both sides. When you read it, I think somewhat fairly, you're like, yeah, it was a brutal time period. You had lots of things that make us uncomfortable today. But I think it's like a number of issues as well. Like, we kill tens of millions of babies in the womb, but we do it surgically behind closed doors, so it's not out in the open. So there's no stories of like the Crusades where there's mounds of bodies outside the gates of Constantinople. So it's different in the way that it's viewed. We still fund trillions of dollars to wars we shouldn't be in other parts of the world. We still do those things, and we send other kids, other people's kids to go fight them. So we still have violence, but I think today it's more of a hypocritical approach to how we view the role of violence.
Yeah. And I would say that there's even room to make an argument that there were times when the European side went too far. And if you read, even just read the Conquest of Muhammad, which every Muslim is supposed to do, you read about the way that wars were conducted in these areas. And I think that there were many times when Christian soldiers should not have stooped to that level. But the difference is that the Conquest of Muhammad is a description of someone who Muslims are supposed to emulate. So that is another lens through which we should look to these. And what's fascinating to me is if you don't have a good historical understanding of this time period, this geographic region in this time period, it's so easy to think, like I grew up reading Usborne books, and there's these specific time periods. There is ancient Rome, and before that there's Egyptians, ancient Rome. Then there is knights and crusades, and then there is cowboys. Like these are the time periods, and they're also geographic regions that are real simple and easy to draw out. But it's really easy to forget about the fact that we have the Byzantine Empire, we have the whole Eastern Empire. Armenia is the first Christian nation. There are churches in Egypt that I have visited that are older than Muhammad. They were built by Christians long before Islam was on the scene. Hagia Sophia, some of the greatest, most beautiful churches ever built before Islam in, what is now Muslim territory. Yeah. If you go visit, anybody who goes to visit Al-Azhar, which is the oldest Islamic university, is in Cairo. And there's a giant mosque that's right next to it. And it's also beautiful, and it has beautiful pillars. But if you look closely at the pillars, you will see that they're all different heights of pillar because they're all from churches. So they all have they're all on bases, they're all on a different height of base. And so there was this incredibly vibrant pre-Islamic culture where Egypt was a Christian nation for centuries. And I think that there's a great argument to be made that the squabbling of the Christians invited the judgment of God. That's why Islam was able to come down. But imagine that you are part of Christendom, and you live in Europe, but your Christian brothers are not just in Europe. You have Augustine, the greatest church father, so great that even, Catholics and Protestants alike claim him, in Africa. You have incredible church fathers in Alexandria. You have amazing historic churches, even without some of the relics, without some of the other stuff coming along that attach to the Holy Land. This is how the East, the Middle East, was before Islam. It wasn't just, this was always this territory down here for these folks, and then this territory up here was for the knights, and then up north was the Viking territory. Like, that is not how it's actually, it's not actually how it's broken out.
Yeah, and a lot of it too, I think one of the false narratives that we've had on repeat in our culture, especially, public schools, into the university system, is that Islam was this really advanced, art, education. They were the ones who were the great, engineers of their day, mathematicians, all that sort of thing. Rodney Stark's really helpful on this one because he talks about really what happened is they would steal Christians who were really good at those things. They would co-opt it into their culture. And then, of course, they would rename the guy. So it'd be like, oh, yeah, Muhammad, whatever, is the guy who invented this. Yeah. He was actually a Christian from a different area. The other thing that's really interesting, it gets downplayed. I think Wikipedia, for example, if you look up like the burning of the library at Alexandria, I think it's pretty clear. Even the Muslims claim to have done it. But when you look it up on Wikipedia, they're like, oh, it's really controversial. We're not sure who burned the library.
Let's just say a fire started.
A fire started by, and literally you read the Muslim accounts and they're like, we did it. We need no book but the Quran.
And when Notre Dame caught on fire, like recently, let's not cast blame, on anybody.
Cast blame. It was electrical
fire
wiring.
sometimes happens.
So I think kind of that ideal that we have to deal with, that no, it's not the height of civilization. You look at the nations and the trade and the economic impact when Islam came in, most of that was shut down. They went kind of back to pre-tribal, pre-antiquity type cultures. It's a raiding culture, like very third world in that way. What did you expect was going to happen?
And in the Byzantine Empire, that area there, that was where most of culture and art survived after the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of leftover, and there are guys like one of my favorite scientists, not my favorite Muslim scientist, one of my favorite scientists of all time is Ibn al-Haytham, who is claimed by the Muslims. He did live in Egypt, but this is a guy who lived in Egypt at a time when it's illegal to not be a Muslim, and he spent almost his entire life under house arrest. So I would argue that he may not have been a great Muslim, even though he was. He was a great scientist. And none of his ideas were implemented. Part of the reason he's one of my favorites is he's kind of an underdog. He had these amazing ideas centuries before they were put into effect. If he had been in Europe, his ideas would have been published and they would have been economic engines for the culture that he lived in. Because he was in Islam, he lived in house arrest. He wrote his papers, and nobody benefited from his study on optics. It never got actually turned into viable products.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
So just one example.
You see a lot of the same stuff in Europe with the flourishing of, we think about it as the Dark Ages. This is another myth. But during that same time period, you have the flourishing actually of European culture because they were figuring out technologies like, how to plant and sow fields, how to get better plow systems. They're actually, this is one of our favorite
wind
parts.
Power, water power.
Yeah, you have these horses who are like massive for war. Meanwhile, like the Muslims send their horse and one of the Norman stands people punches a horse in the face and it dies. I mean, I told that story to my boys and they're like, you know what? That's impressive. I mean, you punch a horse, it dies.
Is that Bohemond?
It's either Bohemond or somebody with him. Yeah, I can't remember. But
French name, by the way.
Yeah, Bohemond. And a lot of these guys, by the way.
Well, he was Norman.
I mean
okay.
Come on.
I was going to try and take credit.
I claim everybody.
Let's not fight. Let's not fight. There's enough enemies out there.
This is cultural appropriation, and I'm here for it.
I will appropriate anything great to the Sauvé name and
right.
and jettison anything gay. Yeah, that's my whole. Yeah, even in the Middle East, in Islam, Islamically ruled regions, they didn't use the wheel. And so they were just like technologically backward. They were backward in nutrition, culturally backward. This was a terrible place to be a woman or a child, a terrible place to be someone who was out of the dominant culture. And meanwhile, again, and it's not like white hat, black hat, where Christians never sinned and Muslims only did evil things. But generally speaking, if you could have picked which one you wanted to live in, any sane person would say, oh, I don't want to live in the vaunted, technological zenith of Islam. I would like to live in Christian medieval Christendom, please.
Yeah.
There's a fascinating difference in just the styles of feudalism, because they both were feudalistic sort of governmental structures, different in different places, different times, but there is a criticism of European feudalism, which is, the king makes this guy a baron, and then he just has this property for generations, and his sons just get rich because they just own the property. And it's like, yes, there are often downsides and sometimes abuses that happen with that. But the Islamic system of feudalism was, you get given a piece of land for a real short amount of time, which means instead of building it up and cultivating it and possibly building a gigantic, ridiculously huge house, but instead of building that area up and taking care of the people on it, you only have it for a short time. And so you just strip mine that thing. You just squeeze that fiefdom that you have for all that it's worth, because your sons aren't going to have it. You might not have it next year. So there is no cultivation. Now, sometimes there are, people who amassed wealth and misused it, but so much better than people who just completely devastated a region because there was some value that they could get out of it in the few short years that they had, the caliph's favor and the control of this fiefdom. So kind of like Dune, actually, now that I think about it.
Oh yeah, mining spice. Yeah, I'm a dork too, so that's all right. That's actually really interesting because if you consider the objectives, the highest aim of Christianity versus Islam, you have Christianity, which really, in a lot of ways, if you look at the Middle Ages, was building Christendom. You're building to the glory of God. You're building a place. You're building a people. All to the glory of God. You're putting in beautiful buildings and beautiful architecture and amazing art and great music, wonderful streets, like cultivating a people in a place where, so that would be one of the highest ideals within Christendom. And then you have with Islam, you have jihadist war. That's really the highest aim, is martyrdom, killing, infidels and things like that to gain reward. And so you have really two different visions for the future, what it should look like. And they're going to create different types of places. One is definitely more pleasant, and one is definitely a hellscape full of, sex slaves of little boys and girls and women.
Well, it's really comes back to the question of what is the good life and what is the ideal man? And the way that the Christian tradition answers that question, and I believe in God's providence, Christianity was established when it was where it was for a reason, in the midst of this great Greek and Roman thought, where for centuries they'd been asking the same question, Cicero, on the good life. Like, what is the good life? What is the ideal man? And they had sort of felt their way there, as through a glass darkly. Paul at the Areopagus, and when he comes into these cities, is he can speak to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers and say, you've been worshiping blindly. You've been feeling your way. Let me tell you who the true God is. And Christianity gives this answer of the good life and the good man as the man who lays his life down for his people, who gives his strength for the sake of his neighbor and his God, to the glory of his God. Kings who are not to build up for themselves great harems and great wealth, but who are to serve the people. This is all the way back to the Mosaic law in the Western juridical tradition. Whereas in Muslim lands, who's the ideal man? Well, it's Muhammad. What is he like? Well, he's marrying 12-year-olds, and he's establishing huge harems through, brute subjugation, and he's a man of war who sheds blood. Unlike David, who's not even allowed to build a temple because his hands were hands filled with blood. The Christian answer to the good life and the good man is so fundamentally opposed to the way that the Muslim answers that question that I think it's such a perfect foil to show you essentially this is the way, which way, O Western man? The way of Islam is the way that spirals endlessly downward into the politics of the brute. It's the politics of might makes right. It's red in tooth and claw. It's just nature. Whereas Christian society is grace perfecting nature. It's man not giving into his basest urges and putting a veneer of religious, false beauty over them, as Islam does with all of the basest instincts of the human flesh. So it's such a perfect foil. You see it play out civilizationally over and over and over again. And again, to our point today, it's why it's so important that we understand these things in their true nature so that we can have an immune system culturally against allowing the establishment and really the conquest of Islam, which will settle for nothing more than global dominance. They're basically successfully conquering England and Europe, and they will attempt to conquer America if we allow it.
Well, I think that's why it's important to understand like the way it's being used today through immigration. Like if you go to the UK, you actually got the globalist regime leaders who are channeling those people here. I think the US, 10 million people a year. The South Americans like really excited. Bukele and those guys are like, we're really excited. We got rid of MS-13. And they're like, oh, where did they go? The US. So it's like, you're going to have real problems in understanding, like to Brian's point, contra the regime, contra the left, contra all that. To use I think it's a Faramir quote from Lord of the Rings. Yeah, we hate all that. We're against that. We're fighting that. But ultimately, we love our people. We love what's behind us. We have a culture that we're building, and we're getting that too from the original Christendom that we saw that was so beautiful. And as Dan mentioned, just that it was a thriving culture, and we want to see that replicated rather than the desecrations of whether it's the Olympics, where you're watching like trannies on stage. And meanwhile, the same people who are doing this, like Kamala Harris is saying, JD Vance is so weird. He's talking about having a family and wanting children. He's so weird.
It's like when Faramir says that I do not love the arrow for its swiftness or the sword for its brightness. I love only that which they defend. That's the way to get an immune system as a culture against any conquering ideology in people. You have to love the thing that you are in your building enough to defend it. And right now, the way that they've eroded our will to defend it is by eroding our love for it. By saying it's a shameful thing. You come from shameful people. You come from slavers who, were just chattel slavers. And you come from a people who were anti-Semitic. And you come from a people who just conquered this great peaceful civilization of Islam in the Crusades. You're a violent, bloody people. You don't exist. You don't deserve to exist and defend your particularity anymore. You have to undermine that will to fight and defend by destroying a people's love for the beauty of that culture. Which is why this is not just a little historical sideshow, that we have these kind of conversations and understand this.
I would love to talk about the Crusades purely from a military strategy perspective, a tactical perspective, the weapons technology playing out, the logistics. But there is a lot more at stake here, and the way that these different cultures play out is huge. The other area of historical revisionism is I've constantly been told that Christianity and Islam are not only equals, they are not only equally valid in terms of personal religious choices that you can make, but they're also really the same. And there's definitely similarities because Muhammad grew up in a town. It was the trading crossroads, and Christians were there passing to and fro. He was familiar with Jewish teachings and Christian teachings. There's a lot of familiarity as you read the Quran, but there are some things that are just complete opposites. And I think a perfect example of this is in the law of God, within the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way that you deal with a thief is that he makes restitution so that the victim is made whole. And the New Testament even goes further and says, you make the thief work with his hands. Like, this is how the thief is healed as well as the victim is made whole. This is the punishment for stealing. And then in Islam, it's just cut hands off. Yeah. So now you got a guy who the victim is not made whole by this. The thief is not made whole by this. The thief now cannot work with his hands. Do you think he's going to keep being a thief? Is that the only option that is now available to him moving forward? So while, yes, there are some similarities between the Bible and the Quran in terms of specific prophets that are mentioned by name, but only by name, the goals are literal opposites, and the fruit is literal opposites, even just within the text.
Yeah, I think you can even look at, modern tactics that actually date back to like the, medieval period. But something like, what we see now with bombing a, London subway station to kill innocent civilians. That's traditionally, with Augustine and just war theory, that was traditionally something that was off limits. Even the really fascinating story in terms of, weaponry and technology. But in Europe, the crossbow was made illegal because it was so effective. And they felt like it was dishonorable that you didn't have to train as an archer would or somebody with a sword.
I have mixed feelings on that, but go on. Yeah,
yes. Yeah. But it's interesting because here they are. They probably shouldn't have been fighting each other in the first place. But you have this, you have this technology that's like super effective. By the time the Crusades start, you're like, okay, now they're fighting the Muslims. Godfrey's, hoisting up this 800-pound, ladder to shoot crossbows at the enemy. They're like, it's fine. Okay, but there's still something of just war theory and honor and fighting and who you would wage war on. This is actually one of the reasons I think it became so complicating for the Christian West. And was it a compromise when you start bombing civilian populations? So you've got to really think these things through. I think traditionally with Islam, they're like, yeah, take a young Muslim kid, give him a crock pot full of pipe bombs and send him out into the Boston Marathon, see what he can do. That's generally not what the Christian mindset has been. If anything in the West today, it's weakness. But even when it was strong, they weren't saying like, hey, let's go, bomb civilians or do that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. Deuteronomy has strict restrictions on what you can do during war and when you can go to war and the limitations of the king and so forth. Like there is a Christian tradition that can be traced back to specific verses. And there's nothing like that in Islam. Instead, well, and again, it gets worse as you look at the life of Muhammad, but there are many speeches that he gave to his soldiers explaining why it is okay to rape the women of the defending soldiers, why it's okay to tear people in half with camels, like why these are good ways to go about prosecuting war against your enemies. So yeah, total war, I would like to blame it on Sherman and other people like that, but it dates way, way, way back.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's also interesting too. I mean, it gets to another question of cultural superiority. Like we're not allowed to say that some cultures are better than others. Hence the like egalitarianism. They have to be, all religions are equal, whatever, right. Which is total nonsense.
The cannibals that ate Joe Biden's uncle, just as.
But this is the absurdity of it, right? You have the people in America on the left who are usually always also feminists. And then, I remember years ago, like in college, I was like, this is sometime after, 2001, 9/11, all this has happened. I'm like, you know what? I've never read it. I think I'm just going to get a copy from the Oxford publishing house. I'm going to get a copy of the Quran. I'm going to read it. I want to know what they say in their own words. And, I remember reading through there and it's like, if your wife burns the food, first strike her with an open hand. If she does it again, strike her with a closed hand. And I'm thinking like, do the feminists know what is being taught here? Like, this is very not egalitarian. It's sort of the same thing.
If a woman walks in front of you while you're praying, you have to start over because she will actually mess the whole thing up. Yeah.
Well, even the
liberals defending Islam is like sheep defending a wolf. It's just, it makes no sense.
Crazy. I have my obvious objections to him speaking to Congress. But one of the funny comments that Netanyahu made recently was he said, yeah, I see these gays for Palestine. And I think to myself, that's like chickens for KFC. Like, what are these people doing? But it really is. It's like, what they do to gay people, right? Like, why are you supporting this? And I think really what it is, again, going back to this theme of the globalists are willing to partner with anyone who is proficient at destroying Christians in the Christian West. And so you have all these weird alliances where, that's what you're going to see on TV.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating thing. And when you get rid of the historical record, when it's inconvenient, you end up missing a lot of data points that would have actually been helpful for you as you continue to execute your plans into the future. Like it is a very self-defeating kind of mentality. This, postmodernism taken to its actual extreme is fantastic for destroying your enemies, but it doesn't give you any foundation to build on.
No, and I think even with recent stuff with there was a Ford truck commercial and it shows people from like literally every walk of life. Like you have like Latino day workers and like, black people from Africa. And they're like, the one thing that unites us is that we all bought Ford. And I'm like, yeah, a consumeristic decision isn't enough to hold together a people, right? You have to have common loves, common culture, common language. You read the founding fathers, John Jay, they all said this. And today, I think it's the result of what you're talking about. Everything has been eroded. So there's actually no bond to hold people together. You combine that with, even in 1984, Orwell's book, you can memory hole stuff, but like they even had to like burn paper. But think about how fast you can memory hole a culture, an entire culture. If you can memory hole like an assassination attempt or the fact that Joe Biden is somehow still like incontinent, but around? Like in the Oval Office, like how is the 25th Amendment not invoked? We're not sure. Right.
But I can tell you why the 25th Amendment's not being evoked. It's because somebody made a deal with Kamala Harris. So that's why. It's real simple. Yeah.
But you look at that, and even for the left, it's like, what holds you together? There's not a lot of strength there. And I think that's why you see so much of the culture and America just coming apart.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of
the love of Kamala Harris is not enough, just like the love of Ford is not enough. Hating Donald Trump feels like it might be enough, but ultimately it's no different than hating Chevy. Like, it is not a cohesive worldview.
Well, I don't know if you saw it, but New York Magazine, they had Kamala Harris was sitting on it was like a giant coconut, but they called it
I thought
like
that was
a return
offensively racist.
Camelot.
Yeah.
Camelot.
Yes.
I was like, okay, that's actually a JFK reference, but
yes, but my first thought was that it was A, horribly racist, or B, some kind of like Monty Python and the Holy Grail reference. I didn't realize that it went back to a speech that no one ever heard. That's what it's apparently referencing, a speech of hers and JFK's Camelot. Yeah.
No, one of the things I was going to bring up is with this modern secular movement that you say it doesn't seem to have cohesion. I think there is one thing that is definitely binding together this ideals of the left, and that's the hatred of God and of his image bearers. And the reason I say that is because so much of the direction that they're moving is dehumanization. So Eric mentioned abortion earlier. So you have unborn image bearers that they're destroying, ripping apart. You have the transgender movement to where you're actually mutilating image bearers to where they don't have the ability to reproduce. More image bearers and their masquerade of what a man or a woman should look like. You have homosexuality, which is a disorder of human relationships in procreation and in marriage. You have all of these different things that are essentially defacing the image of God. And I think that's one of the things is that's uniting this movement is just, I hate God and you all are like him in that way. I mean, they're humans.
It's like inevitably self-destructive.
Yes, it's self-destructive.
Yeah.
That's why I think dystopian literature will continue to be popular, is because we are getting a taste of what dystopia world looks like, is because you have a bunch of people out there that actually hate people. They hate God. Yeah. They want to deface and make monsters out of humanity. And so I don't know if you can publish any of this on your podcast or not.
Oh no, we're rolling with all this. My only hesitation is that I thought we were going to talk more about the Crusades, but I think we should keep unpacking this because ultimately, I completely agree with you. Hatred of Donald Trump is like it's solid good. Like New York Times eats that stuff up with a spoon. Hatred of Donald Trump, it kind of unifies people, but ultimately it's not enough. There has to be something where the hatred of the God that they actually know exists, and the hatred of aspects of his creation and his image bearers, I think that is a true cause. And that's part of the reason that you can see this level of coordination is kind of the wrong word. No coordination is required. Sinful people will gravitate toward destruction. And destruction is just easier. It's easier to go downhill. There's entropy in the natural world. There's entropy in the human heart and the human soul. It takes work to do the opposite. So it actually, annoyingly, frustratingly, but also this is great battle cry. Like, to build requires coordination and effort. It requires teamwork. It requires so much, and destroying is just easy. It's too easy.
Yeah, you can just have loose affiliations.
The left goes to that.
Yeah, you don't have to have any ties other than we both want to destroy. That's why it's so weird when you see the left encouraging Muslims. It doesn't make any sense. Like, they literally don't like anything that you are, but they're able to extend the olive branch essentially because the history of Islam is a war of terror, especially against Christianity. And so you see, you want to tie back to the Crusades. You essentially see a war of terror against Christianity, where it was really common with mutilations, with beheadings. One of Eric's favorite characters had a lot to do with impaling. So they would use terror tactics. They would conquer a city and they would impale people on these pikes all over the city, right? So you walk into the city and you're passing through all of these bodies that have been impaled, and Drac the Impaler.
Yeah, Vlad Dracula. Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting too because, with Vlad and other of these Christian nations, so you compare our time period in the left and whether it's Islam or other forces that are seeking to destroy Western civilization, Western culture. But I think the other thing that history teaches you is this is not the first time. There were times in the past where men had to stand and fight. You look at somebody like, Vlad Tepes or Vlad Dracul,
Defender of Christendom.
Yeah, he's actually
Order of the Dragon.
Order of the Dragon. He's a Christian prince. Kidnapped like many Christian sons were, became janissaries, usually raped by the sultans.
Catamite.
But the reason that he understood war tactics and that he develops these tactics of impaling and really of driving fear into the heart of the enemy is because he spent so much time with the Muslims, with the Turks. And so it's interesting. You look at his time period. He defends Wallachia. Skanderbeg will defend his country. John Hunyadi, kind of in that same era, same places adjacent. And then you look at it and you're like, well, why did they eventually get taken over by the Muslims? And the answer to that question is because other Christians betrayed them for money. And so you look at our time period and you're like, okay, talk about coalition. It's like, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, but he said, when you look at the defeat of the West, he said, it always starts with somebody within betraying and opening the doors to the barbarians. And so I think some of the first initial things that we have to do is have consolidated forces. People have to understand that there's a battle going on for the soul of the West. You have to understand that like we've talked about, quite a bit on our show, like we can't be like attacking people who are 3 feet away from us in the trench on the same side over.
Wait a minute. I forgot to ask, are you guys Baptist or Presbyterian? Sorry, go on.
We are. Yes, that's right. That's right. Presbyterians. Come on. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, who in the grand scheme of things, who is the real enemy? We have to be able to identify that. I think that, I think it's today, Meg Basham's book is coming out on the evangelical elite leaders who sold out the country during COVID. Francis Collins, who was cheerleading with Rick Warren and others, Russell Moore, David French, all these guys to push the COVID narrative, which killed people and destroyed people's livelihoods. And so you look at it, it's like, well, who sold us out? Well, it was our leaders. They need to be held accountable. And we need to raise up different leaders. Again, all of this going back to the Crusades. And one thing that I like about Vlad, to close the loop on the Impaler himself, the reason the West loses is not because it doesn't have strength and resources. It does not have the will to win. That's what we lack right now. It's an issue of the will. And you think about, I was reading a study yesterday. It's like over 50% of white women are like hyper depressed. That was 2020. Advanced 4 years, it's probably worse. Over 50% of the female population in white America wants, they're suicidal, they're depressed, they don't think they have anything to live for. Well, it's kind of a parallel of the West as a society and civilization, isn't it? Right? If individual level people want to kill themselves, well, yeah, the nation is like suicidal. And I think it's a result of apostasy and decadence. And so like that will has to be addressed in the messaging, the stuff that we talk about.
This whole conversation reminds me of just this theological concept that's foundational to, again, the good life, the Christian life. What is the good life? What's a life where your loves are properly ordered? You can love yourself rightly because you don't love yourself as supreme. You love God as supreme. You love your neighbor as yourself. But these loves, like a proper love has to reach escape velocity out of our fallenness to get out of the orbit of this black hole that's collapsing inward on itself of craven self-love. And so cultures like Islam that are built on fundamentally craven self-love, where I'm just going to subjugate, dominate, conquer, take everything to myself. All the caliphs and the leaders, like you pointed out earlier, in the difference in their feudalism, they would just build up empires, and they didn't even care a lot of times about their own sons. They didn't raise up good successors because they just cared about themselves and their heap of treasures.
72 virgins.
To hell with it. When I die, it's over. I'm done. They would kill their own kinsmen, constantly warring, palace intrigue. It just reminds me again back to that fundamental point of if you don't, by the grace of God, reach that escape velocity of self-love collapsing inward on itself, then you will always be miserable, and you'll always just be a society of a bunch of little black holes walking around consuming each other and ultimately destroying everything around you. And black holes can team up with other black holes to suck in and destroy even more things,
well,
even if they hate each other.
And a lot of that has been encouraged because, well, we don't have a positive vision for the future. So when you weaponize guilt and say you should actually feel bad for just who you are, that you were born where you are, with the color skin that you have and the certain religion that your parents raised you in, you should actually feel guilt for that. And then there's no hope for the future. What do you think is going to happen?
But you also have guys like Jean-Paul Sartre in France who are actually saying things like the greatest gift Western white men can give to the world is to die.
Yeah.
And you have people echoing
Sartre
that
was
today.
ahead of his time even. Yeah.
He was.
He could be the nominee today.
He could be. Now they're like, that's not very right. You're just a middle of the road.
The
guy,
DNC's like, whatever drugs we've been giving Biden before speeches, like, let's see if that will work on the old corpse of Jean-Paul Sartre.
The old corpse. It might. You never know.
Reanimate
Dig up
him.
Rousseau. Like there's quite a few actual.
Rousseau could be the running mate.
What is the
it's
Glenn
fascinating
Sunshine
to see
quote
the
about
development.
Rousseau?
Yeah, he said if Hitler, Stalin, and Rousseau were in a room and I had a gun with 2 bullets, I'd shoot Rousseau twice. Dr. Glenn Sunshine.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. So there are thought leaders in Western civilization, recent Western civilization, thought leaders who have this type of self-loathing and hatred for their fathers and the culture that has come before. And I do wonder if, because when you look at the history, the Crusades are such the opposite of what we have been taught. They are not greedy, kind of neo-colonial robber barons going down and stealing stuff from the Muslims. In fact, you almost see the opposite of this, and this still survives. This still survives in the Robin Hood story. The problem with Richard the Lionheart is not that he is looting and pillaging the Holy Land. It is that he is actually neglecting his people. His sin is that he is being too selfless and possibly being too selfless with his own people. This is actually kind of the true record of most of the Crusades. Again, there's lots of Crusades. And I think that this level of, it's almost like in some cases you see poor stewardship where the fault is going too far, loving the Christian brothers down there too much, wanting to fight the enemy on more fronts than you can actually sustain. Like these are actually the downfalls of some of the Crusaders, and again, there's many Crusades, and some of the worst ones that I can think of, because we can point at failed Crusades, like the Children's Crusades, where there's an emphasis on piety that leads to absolute disaster, horrific consequences for people who are being misled by tremendous selflessness and good intentions. So there's just so much history and so many lessons from all of these things. I love the conversation that we have had, but we have actually talked about specific crusades pretty sparingly so far.
Yeah, it's interesting with somebody like Richard. Because he, for people who want to say it was like colonialism, I mean, he was kind of the one, I think this is like the Third Crusade, right, with Richard, but they figured out, they were like, look, if we don't have like a supply line and like a funding plan, and like, he basically goes over there and he says, we're not even going to take Jerusalem. Like what it would even be the point? They're going to retake it almost immediately. Of course, you've got wars breaking out in the homeland. He's got to return. What's interesting to me, when you read about Richard the Lionheart, you read about Duke Godfrey of Bouillon, and you read their journals, and you can fast forward or go, whichever direction in history, and you'll find the same with Jan Sobieski. These guys were devout Christians, and their writings and their prayers on their deathbed, like John Hunyadi and Skanderbeg, their prayers on their deathbed are recorded, and it puts modern Christians to shame. And so one of the things that irritates me is when Christians today are so quick to scoff at those men, and I read the accounts of them, And this is how we can, deal with the false history. Fortunately for us, we can go back and like read their journals and what people said about them who served with them. And then you realize these were great Christian men, many of them. Yes, they had faults. Yes, they were men. But especially, you mentioned this earlier, somebody like Richard, not only was he feared by Saladin, but when he was respected by his enemies. I mean, it got to the point in the fighting where Saladin was like, yeah, if Richard's there, like, we're not fighting. I'm going to tell you guys this right now. The only time they started fighting was after Richard went home. And they fighting again. They were like, yeah, he's gone. So the fight continues. But until he left, it was like, yeah, we don't engage. He'll kill us. And
well, they did try to sneak up on him one time. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. And he and like 10 of his knights with no armor jumped on their horses and just laid waste. And one of the most epic things I've ever read.
Oh, it's crazy. Yeah. And even the accounts of it afterwards, like where they're reporting back to like Saladin or, whoever the emirs. And they're like, what's going on? We've got enough men. Why are we not? And they're like, there's a man in the middle. And they describe him. And they're like, there's like a 12-yard path in the middle of our line that is being decimated. Anyone who goes near him, they're explaining all this. And he's like, it's Richard. I know who that is. It's one thing to read the songs. Yeah, it's one thing to read the songs of like your own bards who write about your valiant exploits later. But it's another thing when the enemy tell of your exploits and the carnage that they describe is greater than your own like war songs. Yeah, and it's amazing too. I think the range of some of these guys. So you take like Richard. I think he goes home. He's wounded in battle. It's like mistakenly shot by an archer or something like this. And it's amazing because he's dying and he forgives the man. And so this is the other thing, that there's these men are men of range and incredible mercy, as well as they're not just bloodthirsty, genocidal colonialists, as, we would use that terminology today. Again, people like Godfrey refusing to take the title of the King of Jerusalem. He said, Christ wore a crown of thorns. Who am I to receive the title of kingship? I will serve, but, no more. I'm not going to take that title. So I think just the devotion, the piety of these guys, it's also really hard for us to understand today. We talk about that piety versus pietism. And today It's like, we're told like even defending your wife from an intruder is ungodly. You're hearing this from the pulpit in America today. And it's like, wait a minute, this is absurd. We actually have examples we can point to of guys where I actually want to point to like Richard for my sons and say, son, if you can even just aim in the same direction and make like 4 inches of progress and you end up 4 inches closer to the character of King Richard, like things are going to be pretty good for you. So like go that way. It serves as a good example. And a lot of these men were, much the same, but as we tell these stories, as our sons hear them. Deanna, I think, what was the story your son was like, Dad, will you tell me that story again?
Oh, it's the Winged Hussars.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Like the kids love this sort of thing.
Well, they have horses with riders that have angels' wings. They were called the Angels of Death. And they decimated them.
I still love this. I think 683 is the Siege of Vienna, something like that. But what I love about it is Jan Sobieski, they said he's old and fat. He rides to the top of the hill. He doesn't actually have that many troops compared to how many of the enemy are down there. And what I love is he looks at the enemy's position and he says, they are badly encamped. They know nothing of war. We will surely win. And I'm like, you're outnumbered. Like, I don't remember. It was like 25-1 or whatever it was, but it's like a lot to a little.
According to Sabaton, it's 15-1.
Okay, Sabaton, that's right. They must be right.
Nothing reminds me of Eric Kahn more than that moment. They're badly encamped. We will surely win. Eric, there's like 15 of them for every one of us. We will surely win.
We got this. Yeah. And you love to see it.
Yeah. There are Eastern European rock bands that write ballads to this day about the Winged Hussars. It's embarrassing that we have forgotten about this, and our rock bands write, terrible music.
I've actually wondered about this.
Was Freebird about the Winged Hussars? No? I always thought it was. I'm sorry.
This is what I love though. It's like you look at Hollywood and it's so horrible. And there's been a few shows. They did The Last Kingdom, the total butchering of the life of the Christian king, King Alfred. And, you know, it's turned into a soap opera. But it is interesting to me. I read these stories and I think, you know how many great movies haven't been made? You know? I mean, like, some of them have. You've got El Cid with Charlton Heston. But come on, they didn't have the CGI. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have if you could do like The Ride of the Rohirrim.
With Michael Bay. No, not Michael Bay.
Just think.
Let me take that back.
Michael Bay. Okay, you just get out of this room.
I mean, there are cannons and stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
at the Siege of Vienna.
Come on. What was it? 1683?
They put mines underneath the walls to try to blow them.
Okay, so that's pretty bad.
So it could be.
No Terminators.
Yeah, I can picture the Bayhem already. Yeah, for sure. Well, no,
the Bayhem.
So some of these stories, it is a shame to lose them. And I was reminded of this. I wasn't even telling a actual history story. This was a few months ago. I was talking to the kids at breakfast, and I started telling the story of Beowulf. Not even just like at breakfast, you know, thinking about going to work, like just like, what's the story of Beowulf? Oh yeah, well this is the basic framework, and like I'm not even in storyteller mode. And my 4-year-old son is just absolutely riveted by my half remembered, kind of half there sort of explanation, you know, super boring and clinical breakfast recollection of Beowulf. So I bought the Tolkien translation. It was on my to-do list. And in the back is a simpler translation. And we read that, and it was far more gripping to the kids than so many other books that we have read. And these stories, and Beowulf is, you know, fictional. We don't even know exactly what it is, but just the...
Well, I mean, come on, let's not go crazy.
The stories
of Grendel and a dragon.
It obviously happened, you know. Yeah, it obviously happened. Some of the words, we're not sure if they're describing like giant supernatural ogres or just regular Democrats. It's unclear. But one of the things that came out of this is just like a rekindling, a reminder for me that just stories of people with good character who stand up to, and Beowulf stands up to, giant foes, the unfriendliness of traitors, just like the things that he stands up to, and just has a calm countenance and just does what is right in those instances, was utterly gripping to my kids. And, you know, obviously swordplay and monsters are cool, but that is something that just grabbed them at a very visceral level. How much more so when that is people who actually lived, people who fought on battlefields that you can go and visit, you know, people who built the towns and the cities that your ancestors lived in, stuff like that. These are things that are so inspiring that, if you are a destroyer, if your goal is to destroy, you have to destroy those guys first, because their legacy is inspiring to people. Even people who don't even know what it is that they want to accomplish, when they hear stories like that, they want to be part of those kind of cavalry charges. They want to build those kind of cities. They want to do those kinds of things.
Well, it's incredible, you know, like I think of somebody like Alfred the Great, and we read his story. Ben Merkel has a really good book on him, The White Horse King.
Yeah.
And the only guy in English history to be called the Great as a king of England. And you think, wow, that's incredible. Of all the leaders, you know, England's produced a lot of great men and great things. They've done a lot of great things. But it was interesting to me. In June we had our conference, and I think like Brian was up there talking about Christian Burroughs. You know, we had this conference. There's like 1,000 people there, and behind Brian on our backdrop, it's the logo for our company, which is New Christendom Press. This media company, is King Alfred. It's a, you know, sort of a characterization or a caricature. I don't know, what do you call that, Brian? A drawing. But the logo is King Alfred with the statue with his, you know, scepter raised. And I was thinking to myself, we think of things like the you know, Hebrews 11 and the Hall of Faith, and it kind of hit me in that moment. Two things. Number one, I was saying to myself, do you think King Alfred would have known, like, hey, you know, this many years from now, they're going to be having conferences. He probably was like, a conference? What is that? We're going to live stream it, Alfred. Let me tell you about this. Light particles, you know, it's pretty cool. We send them through some, fiber. Anyway, we're thinking like, wow, isn't that crazy that his legacy lives on and everything that he did? But then I was thinking about it in the Hebrews 11 sense. And I'm thinking, when we die and we join the cloud of witnesses, we're going to see Alfred. I'm like, wow, that's a powerful thing. Think about something like this. The left hates patriotism, right? The root word of patriotism is pater, father. Patriotism means love of the fatherland. So it's like, wow, we hate patriarchy because we hate fathers, and we hate patriotism because we hate the nation that our fathers built. And so I think for us, it's rousing men to understand, look at the inheritance our Christian fathers left us, right? Do you know the reason that you know anything about like sound monetary policy, even though we don't practice that at all? But the reason you know maybe the inklings of what that would be is because men like Alfred fixed it in his day, because they said we need to be an educated people who can read, and we need the scriptures. Actually, this crazy thing Alfred did of trying to get the scriptures into the vernacular of his people. And so you look at all these great things. It was a great audacious. I mean, Alfred was an audacious guy who was living in a swamp, Brian, for a time.
Athelney, Prince Isle.
And somehow this
Back to
guy's
the wall.
like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to build a great nation. And if you would have looked at Alfred in that moment, you would have said, no, you're not. And so I think, again, just inspiration for our people today that, yeah, it looks bleak.
And what it requires is you have to look to men like that, and you have to recognize that for every one Alfred, this is going to sound discouraging, but I don't mean it to be. For every one Alfred that succeeds, 10 of us have to try and die.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing to give that level of, I'm willing for the sake of my people, for my sons, for my church, I'm willing to die. I'm willing to go and take the stand against a stronger enemy, whether, supernatural ogres or regular Democrats. I am going to take a stand and be willing to face loss instead of just, I'm going to make sure that I keep whatever little thing I can secure over here and never wager it, never risk it. That's life. You have to be poured out. You have to risk it all. We remember Alfred with great, honor because he risked it all. And the Lord in his providence was kind and gave him the victory. But we would remember him with honor even if he hadn't won, because he gave it all in a worthy cause.
Yeah, I think even of the great men who defended the West, even like pre-Christian West, but when you think of something like Thermopylae, 300 men at a pass held off the Persian army long enough, and more importantly, inspired other peoples in the Greece Isles to fight for their lives. 300 men that we remember today who held the pass and knew going into that battle, we're going to die. We know we're going to die, but we have to fight for our people. It would be better to fight. Churchill makes this observation. He said, any people who goes down without a fight never returns. But he said, cultures that go down fighting have a way of they're like the phoenix. They come back. And so just saying for our people and for our son's sake, I'd rather be the 300. I would rather be those guys. And then everybody's going to remember, but they fought to the end. They didn't cower in fear, and they didn't pay the Danegeld. They fought.
Yeah, history is full of those examples. The guys at the Alamo come to mind. The battle at Bunker Hill, one of the most important battles. It was a total, complete military loss for the colonial soldiers. Technically, the guys who fought the last man were on Breed's Hill. But that was a key battle on a couple of fronts. Number one, they held the line and they all died to a man. They died so that the city could be evacuated, so their lives could be saved. And some of that was, just their wives and their children, but some of it was war material, enabling people to regroup and fight back against the British. But the other reason that was a key battle was it was incredibly inspiring to other American colonial soldiers. But it also was a bit of a wake-up call for the British, this idea that these country bumpkins and undisciplined farmers actually are disciplined enough that they will stand on a hill against redcoats. They will wait until they see the whites of their eyes, and they will actually fight to the very last man. They will not break and run. They will actually fight. They will actually die. They will actually sacrifice themselves for something. It makes it an incredibly important battle, even though if you just go down the list of disconnected facts, it's just like Bunker Hill, loss. Next battle.
Well, and I think that's also why in modern times, I can not think of very many occasions where I felt like I did watching Trump get shot in the ear, get up, and scream into the microphone. I'm thinking, like, from a security protocol standpoint, I'm like, why is his head exposed? This is atrocious at every level. And yet, this man, blood on his face, shouting fight. You get maybe just a glimpse of what it must have done to the colonials to know that their men had fought like that. Right? Yeah. Again, Thermopylae, the way, it's the way that you fight that's going to inspire your people, right? This idea that courage is contagious. Of course, the Braveheart quote, men do not follow titles, they follow courage. And then they're just cultivating this longing for more of that in our people. And then I tell you what, others like our community, we're fortunate to have some really good men here who are courageous and competent. And when new people come in, they always say, they're like, I better pick up my game here. There's all these great men around me. Like, I don't want to be the loser. And that's what you should hope, that as you read these stories, as you kind of study the history of the past and great men, there's a longing. Brian, you will know more about this than me, but like when you look at Gondor and what Gondor had become, sort of like a diluted kind of man, but they were still looking back to Numenor, and they were looking back as we ought to and saying, like, Godfrey cut a man in half with his sword twice. He like cut a camel in half to prove that he could do it with a dull sword. And we read that story and we're like, I need to practice my sword stroke more. What a king.
Yeah, they talked about Aragorn, Elisar, as this king that brought renewal to the line of the West, because previously, even Gimli's walking through the city of Gondor with Legolas, and he says, the older work is of greater quality than the newer work, the stone work. But we could, bring renewal. And he was picturing a time, if we win, I'll bring some dwarves and we'll make this city, we'll bring renewal. It's a big theme that, even though I think Tolkien, he envisions the history of the West, even he puts it in the lips of Galadriel as a long defeat, which I don't like. I don't agree with him on that. I'm post-millennial. Like, I'm not. Yeah. I'm not into the long defeat.
You don't recede. You don't recede into the West yourself personally. Okay.
No, I don't. I would, love to go to the Undying Lands, but alas, the way has been lost. But I think that theme is really important to see, that one of the purposes of the king, of Elisar, returning was to bring this renewal, where they would stop just looking back at the men of old and thinking, well,
they had stopped having kids.
We're lesser sons of greater sires, and now go, no, but we can be we could be great sires. We could be great men. We could have this renewal in our day. And too often we look back over our shoulder at the past and we see these great men and we think, wow, that was amazing. Too bad none of that could ever happen again. And you go, that's nonsense. These were great men, but they also in ordinary men. They were made of the same stuff as we are. They had the same Lord that we have. There's no reason fundamentally that we can't have generations of great men rising up from our day. That's what we need. We need to actually believe that that's possible.
Yeah.
And not that it's a foregone conclusion that we're just in an endless spiral of decline towards, utter defeat.
Have you guys read any about Prester John?
It's been a long time.
I haven't, no.
This is a fascinating character, a fictional character. So what's interesting is I think that this idea that we are lesser men than our fathers, that there's some glory that we've lost. I think that this is a constant fight for any generation, or that they are falling short of something that they could be, something that a number of the leaders in Christendom throughout the Crusades and different times, they looked at Christendom. They looked at what they were doing. They looked at what was happening, wars between brothers. They looked at sort of failures, and they said, we are not where we want to be as nations, as Christians, as a people. We led this crusade and it failed. These people who shouldn't be fighting are fighting. Surely somewhere there's somebody doing Christendom better than we are. And so they just assumed, looking around at each other, the church has to be doing a better job at winning somewhere else. And so they believed, and I don't know where this started, they believed that there was a guy, Presbyter John or Prester John out there who had a superior kingdom that was doing a better job. It was getting closer to Augustine's city on a hill than they were, to the point where several kings signed a letter that Marco Polo was carrying to Prester John. They figured like, well, you're probably going to meet him. He's probably out there. Like this idea, looking at themselves, looking at their work, looking at their weakness and their failures, assume that somebody out there is doing a better job, I think is a very easy trap to fall into, even for guys who could cut a camel in half with a single stroke, even for guys who are doing the kind of leadership that inspires us today.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. You want to make sure that you have the history to inspire. I think this is why Tolkien also included characters. Of course, he's this great student of the Crusades and Christendom and all that. Like he's drawing a lot of it from this. But this is why I like, Rohan and Theoden, because it's this picture of a guy who's been poisoned in his mind, right? He's a lesser man, but then he comes awake, and he said this is this idea. Like he's the one I think that brings up we may be lesser sons of greater sires, but like we're gonna fight, and even if it's not glorious, and it ends up being glorious, of course. But I think just saying like, yeah, but we have been given this point in the battle, so we're going to do our best. We're going to be inspired. We know that we're going to give an account to the great men who have gone before us and to our sons. And whatever that is, if it's, building a burrow in Ogden, then that's what we'll do. And we'll do it with all of our might. And we'll pray that God would use that. I think the other thing Brian's talked a lot about, we actually have a new book coming out for Haunted Cosmos. And I've been reading this.
Oh, nice. Excellent.
And one of the things I love
Early review right here. One of the things I love most about this is one of the chapters you talk about glory and like what is a man's glory, but also like training ourselves that like you should aim for glory. You want to be glorious. This is an important aspect that we miss largely in today's culture. And maybe that's what some of these heroes are supposed to inspire. Yeah, pietism, like we've believed this lie that sin is chasing after glory, and actually sin is really biblically falling short of glory. It's falling for a lesser glory, a paper thin glory.
Yes.
Instead of the glory, like everything, God is the ultimate glory, that we're to live for the ultimate glory, but we don't live for the ultimate glory by being inglorious. It doesn't glorify God for men to be lame any more than it would glorify the maker of a car to be like, this car, you know what? This car really sucks. Didn't I do a good job making it? No, like be a good
humility is so high.
Humility is
so
humble.
important to us. This car doesn't even work.
It gets negative miles to the gallon and it doesn't start. So, I mean, but we live like this so often that we avoid ambition. We avoid the pursuit of glory. And Paul, even in Romans, he says that basically he divides man into two categories, and the one that we want to be is the one who pursues glory and immortality, is how he puts it. And it's like, that's Paul's vision for the Christian life. And the good life is the man who pursues the right glory rightly, which is the weighty goodness of a thing being and doing what it was made to be and do. So if God made you to be an image bearer, then go and be the best image bearer you possibly can to his glory. And you will then be a glory yourself along the way that reflects the glory of your creator. And like, this is what the great men did. They were glories, incandescent glories, even when they didn't get it all right. they made mistakes but they were still glories.
Yeah. And when they did an amazing, unbelievable thing and were given a fantastic feat of victory over enemies that outnumbered them 15-1, they gave that glory to God.
Like the line you mentioned there, that I will not wear a crown of gold where my Savior wore a crown of thorns.
Yeah, that's what it was.
And so he said, I'll be the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. I will not be the king of Jerusalem. Because there's only one king of Jerusalem. And you're right, they did that over and over and over again. They said, even after doing these remarkable feats of strength, that a man might be tempted to boast in a little bit,
Well, this is where too, it's like even the idea that there's nothing supernatural, or there's not these amazing events that happen with God's intervention in history. And then you read the Crusades and like several of these battles early on, Crusade 1, you've got stories that are inexplicable, like how the Christians endured being sieged. They laid siege to the city, and then the Muslims laid siege to them. So they're like, I don't know how long. It's a long period of time. They're like starving. They have no strength. They decide, well, we've got to attack this larger, rested, well-fed Muslim force. So we're just going to march out and we're going to attack them. We're going to pray to God. And we're going to, take what we can of last communion, and then we're going to march into battle. And they go out and somehow they win this victory. And then everyone to a man, the chroniclers, everybody involved, they say, how did you win? That doesn't make sense. And, the people from the, regions from Constantinople, they're like, how'd you win this battle? And they said, well, it's really simple. St. George showed up and the host of heaven was with us. And it's funny because the historians, even like Raymond Ibrahim, he's like, military historians have looked for plausible answers as to how they did this. And we, quite frankly, don't know.
Well,
and you
Eric,
look at that and you're like, haunted cosmos is real.
Eric, it's because, and stay with me, don't get lost. It's because St. George and an angel showed up. That's how they won.
I believe this with all my heart. It's been verified.
Yeah, they said it. They were there. I wasn't there. So it's like, who are you going to believe?
Yeah. The original chroniclers or today's writers of terrible Department of Education textbooks.
Steeped in dead materialism that has produced nothing but misery and bankruptcy in the modern West. Who will I believe?
Yes.
That's a tough one. You'll have to join us on our next episode while we try to figure out who we should actually pay attention to. I will say, we all of us, present company included, self very much included, need to be reading more history. Period.
Yeah.
But especially these kind of inspiring histories, and there are so many different ways that we need to be inspired, because they're the Crusaders who left everything behind to go and fight and die for the defense of other people. The Knights of Malta who would fight when they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But also people like Alfred who stayed home after just destroying his enemies that people thought were completely it was impossible to resist the Danes. He completely destroyed their armies, but then he didn't press. You'd assume that a king called the Great would then lead a great crusade, against all the Nordic people and bring them, start a new Roman Empire, something like that. Huge conquest. But he stays home and he translates the Bible and he writes laws and he writes songs and he plans cities and he builds boats and he is the servant of his people. There are so many different ways that people have done glorious things that brought glory to God in different ways at different times.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. The tapestry of history is so rich.
I love as well in Alfred's story that God saw fit to write into that story that Alfred forgives, baptizes, and adopts his enemy as his godson, and then sets him over a realm, and the man is faithful to his dying day.
And that's the crazy thing. We're like, that's a really stupid idea, Alfred. And then it works.
Like, I was mad at Alfred when I was mid-story because I thought, for sure, this is going to backfire.
This guy's a sucker.
They're constantly making treaties and the Vikings are going back on their word. They're godless heathens, Alfred. What are you doing? And Alfred's like, I know what I'm doing. Yeah. You don't. Just watch me call my shot. And then the Lord seems like he saves the guy and makes him into, like a glory. It's just... I love that is a part of his story.
United the tribes. Yeah.
Well, it's amazing too. It's
again, you got to be careful which sources you read. Like, yes, Alfred was there, and the chroniclers. But don't you think we should just wait what Wikipedia has to say about Alfred proselytizing with the sword? Like, don't you think maybe we should give some credence to that theory too?
Yeah, even the one who gets this the most probably is Charlemagne. And we were talking to Glenn Sunshine about this, Christian historian. And it's funny because he said, there was like this really brief window where Charlemagne's like, I think we're going to convert at force. And like immediately, I don't know if it's Alcuin or who it is, but one of the clergy comes to him and they're like, we don't do that.
You're like, no, Charlemagne.
He's like, okay.
Are you sure?
Okay. Okay, we won't do that. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, even this idea of like some of the stuff that happened and the way it happened, it doesn't jive. I think the other point too, though, is like, okay, fast forward to different epochs in history now. You have Rhodesia, South Africa, what's going on in the last, 50 years that's, it's pivotal as well. But then you should ask those same questions. Well, they told me that Ian Smith from Rhodesia was a real villainous guy. And then you start reading about Ian Smith and you're like, how come the book that he wrote is out of print and I can't get it?
Yeah.
What kind of books did they ban?
His enemies loved him so much? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just encouragement too, that for people to, yes, read history, be inspired by history, but also to question some of the narratives that we've been given, and look kind of deeper into those. I think you're seeing this more and more, by the way, that I think Tucker Carlson, in his show, he overtook last week Joe Rogan. I think you guys were number 3 behind him and Rogan. It was like Tucker,
T-Rex.
Rogan, and then T-Rex.
I think that's what it was.
That's what we're pushing for that. After this,
and King's Hall was 4th.
we were 4th. We were 4th.
Yeah.
Right after T-Rex.
Haunted Cosmos didn't show. I noticed. It was weird.
Haunted Cosmos, it was 0.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Okay.
It's like even above Tucker, but we already knew that. But you look at it, it's like the way the discussions that people are willing to have. I've actually been astounded in the last 4 years. You have political candidates who are just very openly like, yeah, the CIA killed Kennedy. Everybody knows that. So I think because of that, you have more leeway to lean into some of these stories and just say, no, this is what really happened.
Yeah. And well, I think that the left is running out of threats. Like there has been this idea for most of my life that if the press says bad things at you, you're kind of done.
Yeah, cancel culture.
Nobody believes that anymore. Like
we'd be so done.
We have seen people like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson and Trump build pretty much all of their credibility on the hatred of the mainstream regime legacy media. And also this idea like, well, don't speak too highly of the Crusaders or you will get called a naughty, nasty word that you don't get to call. And it's like, sorry, I get called that word 50 times a day already, so I might as well read about King Baldwin, I guess.
Yeah. You have no power here. That's what we say now. It's just, I'm a racist, bigoted, cis, hetero, patriarchal, blah, 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 blah. And we go, okay, anyway. And then we just keep doing what we're
like, just because of the way you look.
The fact that you said all those things make me think those are good things. Like, I'm confused.
Well, yeah. And
technically, all I was doing was reading about the Robin Hood extended universe, really, when you look at it.
Yeah, come on.
That's funny. Well, I think even history, right? So we started a media company. I was reading actually at the time I was sitting in kind of this weird like cultural moment right before 2020 kicked off. And it's like, PC cancel culture was still pretty apex then. And, I worked in the gun industry and magazines and there was kind of stuff that I was kind of, doing some content around patriarchy and stuff like that. And people were just very gently like, hey, maybe you're going to get yourself fired. And, I'm sitting there thinking about like, what do we do? And, I'm an editor and it's like, this is my career. And I happened to be reading the biography of Stonewall Jackson and the Battle of Manassas, and they're getting their tails kicked by the Union troops. Everybody's in retreat. And there's just this moment of courage where Stonewall Jackson says, this is when we attack. And the man's courage just inspired me to such an extent. We met, somewhere in that time frame through Twitter. It's a great place to meet your friends. And I was like, what if we did like the Jordan Peterson thing? What if we did the Joe Rogan thing? What if we did, what is now the Tucker Carlson thing? What if we just went full send? What if we didn't hide in the shadows and try and like hide what we believe, kind of dabble some of it out there? But what if we just spoke the truth boldly and courageously? And what we started to see, it's really funny to your point. Nobody expected a full attack because they thought, oh no, they're going to live in fear. They're going to hide in the shadows. And, the Mike Tyson quote, most people don't know what to do when they get socked in the mouth. And it was like people were like, "Oh, you're the evil patriarch," and we're like, "Okay, yeah, next." Like what?
If you didn't if you didn't get where you were by their approval, their disapproval can't dislodge you.
That's right.
And that's the key point to remember. It's like I'm not planning on building anything by getting the approval of the regime. So I guess the regime's going to disapprove of us, and we're going to say, "Oh no," anyway, and just keep going.
Yeah, we just keep going.
I already wasn't submitting op-eds to the New York Times, so I'll just keep not doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Oh no, the New York Times doesn't like us. They never did.
Yeah. So, well, I should probably wrap this up by apologizing to the T-Rex Talk listeners that we never actually got very deep into the actual Crusades. However, fortunately, the King's Hall guys, they have more podcasts. You guys podcast more often than we do, and your podcasts are longer, and you do get deeper into the Crusades. So maybe the best thing to do is for our listeners to go find you in the places where normal podcasts are found. And then is there anything else that you guys particularly would like people to look up? You have New Christendom Press, and you have different stuff on there. Any books that you guys want to recommend at this point?
Yeah, I mean, so we're a publishing house for the modern day. We do long form books. We have a book out called Honor Thy Fathers with Pastor Zachary Garris right now, looking at the patriarchal views of the reformers and comparing them to like the deracinated squishiness of modern, even conservative Christians. We're like Eric said, about to publish a book from Haunted Cosmos, which is a book investigating really the supernaturality of the world. And
I read it and I approve.
And Eric approves of it.
Great.
So that book will be coming out soon. We publish music. I set psalms and write original music under my name, Brian Sauvé. We have lots of podcasts: Bright Hearth, King's Hall, Hard Men, Haunted Cosmos. So there's something for everybody out there. And just follow us on Twitter, find us there. And you'll find something that either you love or enrages you, but probably if you're a T-Rex arms person, you'll probably like it. So
sometimes it's good to be enraged. And if people want to read about the Crusades, God's Battalions by Rodney Stark, and then look up Raymond Ibrahim, Defenders of the West, which you can read about Vlad Dracul there, and then also Sword and Scimitar. It's kind of a good 3-part little trio to get people started.
Fantastic stuff. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, the work that you're doing. I appreciate it. I have said this to almost everybody that I've had on this show. I don't have time to listen to podcasts anymore. So getting random, diverse podcasters onto this podcast is a fantastic way for me to catch up with what you guys are doing. And I appreciate you coming on and just opening a few cans of worms. I feel like the next thing that we need to do is maybe dig deeper into specific Crusades, dig deeper into Lord of the Rings and Tolkien stuff, talk to Eric about his history in the gun industry. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that we could talk about.
It has been an honor and a great conversation.
So I want to see your input when it comes to who we should talk to next on this podcast. The ability to have some of these conversations about ancient history, recent history, and different types of projects inside of different companies is really interesting to me, but I want to know what's interesting to you. So let team@trex-arms.com know what you think we should be doing with our interviews.